All right, as you know, the EU suspended its fiscal rules in 2020 in the wake of the COVID crisis. And they have been debating, will be debating for the past couple of years how to introduce and how to change the regime of the fiscal framework. We have a final draft from last April. It's still to be approved, finally, and implemented just come January or early next year. So essentially we'll be discussing the new framework. And our guest is Zsolt Darvas. Zsolt is a senior fellow at Bruegel and also senior fellow at Corvinus University in Hungary, in Budapest. That's where he got his PhD from, and he's teaching at the same place, econometrics. So the plan of this session would be for Zsolt to give us his introduction for about 10-15 minutes. They will follow up with the conversation and questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ioannis, and also thank you for inviting me and coming here to participate in this discussion. So I think the most important economic legislative proposal of the current framework of the European Commission, European Parliament, is about this proposal on the European Union fiscal rules. More generally, it is called economic governance reforms, and it includes not only the fiscal rules, also includes macroeconomic imbalances procedure. Nevertheless, the focus of the draft legislation is clearly on fiscal rules. Now let me briefly explain what is the new proposal on table, what are the strengths and the weaknesses, and then we can speculate what is the chance that an agreement can be reached, and also that the new framework can be put in place in time. So starting with the current framework of fiscal rules, I think there is a broad agreement that the current rules are really dysfunctional. They are overly complex, very much depend on unobserved variables, like the so-called potential output, which measures an equilibrium level of output, and the so-called structural budget balance, which is the budget balance gleaned from the impact of economic cycle and one-time unusual spending items, which is a very nice theoretical concept, but extremely difficult to measure. Also a major, I would say, problem with the current rules is that it very much focuses on year-to-year surveillance. You might recall, for example, there was a big debate between the Commission and Italy a few years ago whether the budget deficit should be 2.2% or 2.1% or 2.3%. So, but really small issues and focusing too much on the annual basis. And ultimately, the current framework indeed was not able to reach its goal, because its goal was to achieve sustainable long-term fiscal positions, while at the same time providing a framework in which the government can support their economies in the time of a downturn, which we called anti-cyclical fiscal policy. But unfortunately, many countries failed to reach sustainable fiscal positions. And also, during the previous crisis, there were many occasions when governments had to tighten the fiscal position when there was an economic downturn. So I think there is a broad agreement that the current framework has a number of weaknesses, less of an agreement on how it should be changed. And I think what the proposal that the Commission put to the table in April is really a brilliant proposal, in a sense that, first when I read, I couldn't believe my eyes, because it was so similar to also what I suggested before, but also many other people suggested before. And it means a complete departure from the current system to have a much, basically a different perspective. So let me explain what is this new perspective. So the new perspective is focusing on public debt sustainability. So whether the debt is sustainable over the medium and longer term, which indeed really matters, because whether the deficit ratio in a particular year is 3%, 1%, or 5%, that's not really indicative whether this is a problem or not. For example, during the COVID-19, many governments had huge budget deficits, but it was not a problem at all. I mean, in 2020, the economies collapsed, tax revenues collapsed, the government had to support households and companies, and also, quite importantly, the healthcare sector. So the fact that in a particular year there's a very big budget deficit is in itself not necessarily an issue. What really matters is in the medium and long term, whether the public debt is sustainable. And the current proposal has this idea in its core. So namely, it requires member states for putting forward medium-term plans, which will be called fiscal structural plan. And these plans must ensure that even when the plan is over, then in the subsequent 10-year period, the public debt to GDP ratio will decline, at least in countries which have public debt over 60% of GDP. And it declined even under stress scenarios. Namely, they envision 3 stress scenarios. One is that the interest rate is higher, the growth rate is lower. The other one is that the primary balance becomes lower, and there's a third one, a so-called financial stress scenario. Now, you could ask whether reaching to about 60% is indeed the right anchor for public debt. And I would, as an economist, I would immediately say no. I mean, in the current circumstances, countries can safely sustain much higher levels of public debt than 60% of GDP. But the 60% is in the EU treaties, and the treaty change would be needed to change that. And I simply think that it's inconceivable that member state could agree on a treaty change. So we have to keep this 60% limit for the public debt in the very long run, and also the 3% limit for the budget deficit as given, and basically design a second best fiscal rule which respects these treaty-based requirements, but at the same time brings economic logic into what fiscal rules the EU countries will have to do. And again, focusing on public debt sustainability in the medium term, I think is really the right way. Now let me also emphasize so I said that there will be an adjustment period which can last for either 4 years or 7 years. And after, when the adjustment period ends, there comes a 10-year post-adjustment period. Then the public debt to GDP ratio must decline under unchanged policies. But these unchanged policies mean has a very special interpretation in the Commission's proposal, because it means that everything is unchanged except the cost of aging. Because in many European Union countries, the cost of aging, which includes obviously pension costs, healthcare costs, long-term care costs, and some related costs, are expected to increase really massively in the years to come. So what this fiscal rule says is that everything must remain unchanged except the fiscal cost of aging. So if the fiscal cost of aging increases during this post-10-year period, then it means that the EU countries must save funds during the adjustment period so that they will be able to finance those costs in the 10-year post-adjustment period, even if they don't do any reforms to address the aging cost. So this unchanged fiscal policy is in fact a very, very tough requirement for many, many countries in which aging costs are going up. Now, what we did is that we certainly not just analyzed, we had a couple of, basically 2 papers on these new proposals. And I must add that beyond this debt sustainability analysis, a set of so-called safeguards were added to the Commission proposal. And the reason, I will explain shortly what these safeguards are, but the reason why these safeguards were added is that many countries simply don't trust the debt sustainability analysis method, because they believe that it's very easy to manipulate. For example, if you assume that growth will be 0.5% higher in the next 15 years, then you can have a much smaller fiscal adjustment now. Or you expect that the interest rates will be a little bit lower, then again you can easily get a much lower fiscal adjustment now. So there's a fear from a number of member states that this debt sustainability analysis of the European Commission can be manipulated and can be tailored to reach the conclusion the Commission wishes to achieve, and thereby deviate from first economic principles. And that's why there are a number of countries, including Germany and Netherlands. I mentioned these countries because these countries publicly put forward proposals even before the Commission made its own proposal on what to include. And basically 4 safeguards were introduced. Now 1 is absolutely sensible, but 3 are not. The one which is sensible is a so-called no backloading condition, which means that the fiscal adjustment cannot be postponed to many later years, because imagine a government which has 2 or 3 more years in the office. The government can say, okay, we will do just a little bit adjustment in the next 2 and 3 years before the elections, but after the elections, whoever will be the next government, either we or another party, they will do all the big and hard work. So from a political economy perspective, I fully agree that it's absolutely important to limit this. So not backloading the fiscal adjustment, but either front-loading or at least keep an equal pace of fiscal adjustment across the years is absolutely important. And with this safeguard, I 100% agree. But there are 3 other safeguards which are, I would say, not really related to the DSA. And I think those safeguards should be either abolished or changed significantly. The first one, which is called debt safeguard, requires that the debt to GDP ratio must be lower by the end of 4 years than when the program starts. So let's assume that the whole framework will start next year in 2024. It means that by 2028, the debt to GDP ratio must be lower than in 2024. Now, you might ask, why is it a problem? Because we want to achieve medium-term debt sustainability. So for countries with high debt levels, the debt should eventually decline. And this principle is indeed correct. But what this debt safeguard means is that, irrespective of the medium and long-term fundamentals, the countries will have to do possibly a relatively large fiscal adjustment upfront in the first 4 years. And as we checked, this safeguard would only be binding for France, at least next year. So there would be only 1 country for which this safeguard would be binding. But for France, it really didn't make sense, because France has a very benign long-term outlook, namely that the aging cost of France is already super high, one of the highest in Europe, but it's not expected to increase any further. So France doesn't have to save, let's say, in the next 15 years to cover aging costs, because they're already paying all those big costs, and then there are very few countries, again, in the EU in which aging costs are not expected to increase, and France is among them. Another very positive development is that if you look at the interest rate and GDP growth rate, again, the forecast, which again could be revised, but the medium-term forecasts do suggest that France is a relatively good position. France is France, as it's often said, and the average interest rate on public debt is not expected to exceed the growth rate, even stays a little bit below. So again, it has a very good medium-term fundamentals, but the starting position for France is rather weak because the current budget deficit is relatively high. So France would need to make a relatively big effort in the next 4 years meet this debt safeguard. But again, from a sustainability perspective of public debt, this would not be necessary. France has to do a lot of adjustment. You know, a country that has more than 4% of GDP budget deficit will have to do a lot of adjustment. But beyond this lot of adjustment which is needed for that sustainability, no more extra is needed to, you know, start the debt falling already in the initial years. So the governments will either have to incentivize by basically subsidies or tax breaks or whatever other solutions the private sector to dose all of those investments, or they have to simply do it by themselves. And this will require a massive increase in public spending on climate. And the current rules would not really help to achieve that, because still they would require, you know, substantial fiscal adjustment from, I mean, most countries, not all countries. I mean, Sweden has a super healthy fiscal position and always meet all the EU rules with a big margin. But many countries will have to do big fiscal adjustment, and it's very hard to see that as countries doing fiscal adjustment in the next 4 years, they increase massively their climate spending. And so my fear is that the climate spending will be the victim of the new fiscal rules in whatever form they will be approved. This will undermine the achievement of the EU's climate targets, both for in the near term, 2030, for example. And you know, if the EU will not meet its climate targets, then, you know, countries all over the world, you know, poorer developing countries would say, oh, even those rich Europeans who colonize half of the world, they're not able to meet their climate targets, so why should we meet our own? So I think it's absolutely essential for the EU to meet its climate targets. It requires massive public funding, but the new framework will not be conducive to that. So this is the third area of improvement, and let me stop here.
Thank you, Zsolt. Well, it's no doubt that the new framework is more improved compared to the previous one. The last one was very tedious, too many rules, and it was too austere for too many countries. This one is more flexible. It allows countries to own their programs in some way, so it's an improvement, obviously. I have the following concern, which there are three things actually. One is green, that you mentioned, Zsolt, that is going to upset the budgets of the governments. Different countries are facing different commitments and different requirements to meet their green targets, so this is going to upset their fiscal dynamics. The second is this change with the interest costs of debt service. We're now talking about a new environment where the cost of debt service is much higher than before, and for high indebted countries it's going to be more difficult to service, and again it's going to have an impact on their interest costs, and debt service is not included in the net spending, but it's a part of the debt which has to decline, and it's going to become binding after a point. And the third is this new environment with the war and the increased defense spending by everybody. That's going to create a new, more need to spend as governments. So in total, there are more commitments, more requirements, and this new framework, while it may be designed to lead countries to decline their debt ratios, it may not be fit for purpose in this new environment. So that's my concern, if you want to comment on it.
No, it's a very, very good point that beyond climate there are many urgent spending priorities, and you know the defense you mentioned is also absolutely important. But let me maybe try to explain why I only mentioned climate and not other things. Because, you know, if you open the door, you say, oh, more needs to be spent on defense, so let's exempt defense. Then other people will come, oh, our healthcare system is in ruins, so we need to spend more on healthcare. Then come, you know, parents associations say, oh, our education system is so poor, we need to spend more on education, and so on. So then all the demands would come one after the other. So if you open the door for different items to be excluded from the fiscal rules, and then it will lead first of all to nowhere. So either we exclude everything and we have no fiscal rules at all, or there will be no conclusion at all. So I think that indeed, I mean, there is some certain lessons from countries like Sweden or Netherlands or Denmark, which always have fiscal space for everything, because they have a very sound national public management. And by the way, it's also resulted from the fact that these countries have much stronger national fiscal rules than what the European Union fiscal rules are. So that would be the ideal situation, that all countries converge there. Certainly we are not yet there. I mean, Greece and Italy, with very high public debt ratios, it will take decades, if ever, if they can reach such a position. So the big question is now how to balance basically the next few years for countries with higher public debts. And the reason that I singled out climate, because climate change is irreversible. So if we screw up and let the global temperature to rise, by more than, I don't want to say this 2%, whatever aim, but if global temperature rises more, then bigger and bigger parts of the planet will be inhabitable. Billions of people might need to move to other places to find basically the possibility of living. So it will really result in a huge human catastrophe if our fight against climate change is not strong enough. So that's why I singled out climate, but I wouldn't single out other things, because countries will need to do fiscal adjustment and need to find a fiscal space for defense and healthcare and education and every other important public spending.
Thank you, Zsolt. I can take a question if there is one. Nikos, very quickly, please.
Yes. Congratulations for the excellent and analytical presentation. Very informative. Congratulations for the excellent and analytical presentation. It was very informative. I have a short question, Ioannis. As you mentioned, in this new era of volatility and the interconnected crisis, we need new frameworks, models, and dynamic tools. Can you give us one or two examples of practical tools that can help public and private sector organizations innovate under conditions of extreme uncertainty, cope with non-linearities and exponential changes, and achieve resilient growth? Thank you.
So one option will be indeed offered by the new framework, because it will requires member states to prepare medium-term so-called structural fiscal plans. And these plans must include all the reforms that the country plans to do in the next 4 or 7 years. And what certainly private organizations, civil society can do is to influence how these reforms, so first of all, what kind of reforms will be proposed and designed, and how these will be reformed. So certainly some countries, many countries have, some formal coordination mechanism, like tripartite, government, employer, and employees. Many countries have these so-called productivity councils, which again aim to help and make recommendations on how the productivity in a particular country could be improved. And certainly organization outside of these I would say formal coordination mechanisms could indeed express their view, influence the productivity council or those organizations which are in these negotiations to basically define better reforms in a better way.
Right, thank you very much. Before we close, I'll take 1 minute and respond to the issue of the Cyprus budget and the surplus that we're having. I think there is a good explanation. One is on the government side, on the spending side. The government has been benefiting from a consensus in the country after the crisis of maintaining prudent fiscal accounts. So the political pressures to change spending are not there in the way they used to be before the crisis. So that helps the government manage the government spending. And on the revenue side, there are a couple of things which favor the government's revenue. One is fiscal track, in the sense that our brackets, the tax brackets, they are dated from 2002. So income has gone way over, and they are getting more for their tax rates on income. And then inflation benefited the country a lot. Taxation here is more indirect than direct, so the government benefited from the high inflation much. And the third area of income has to do with our carbon emissions. We pay penalties, and these go to the government as income, and they're not spent as designed to be spent. So this accumulates a pool of revenues that help a lot the government finances, and they will continue to help us in the next few years until we do tax reform and until things begin to change in terms of the demands on the spending side. And that is now manageable. It's used to be 140% of GDP at the highest. It's now 85% and dropping. And within that 85%, you have a few billion that are cash. It's a requirement from the Commission, from the EDP, that we keep an amount of cash as part of the bailout program until an amount of debt is paid eventually. So this is also supporting the fiscal finances there. And the interest cost, the debt service is it's one of the lowest. It was 1.5% of GDP last year, and it would be as low for the next couple of years, despite the higher interests. Have a very low maturity of the debts, which helps its servicing.
No, very interesting. But this also means that your country has learned the lessons from the crisis and also have more fiscal space now to spend on new priorities like
Indeed.
Everything, education, healthcare, and everything else. Thank you.
So thank you very much, gentlemen. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you very much.